Hi friends, welcome back to my channel, and in today's video we are going to be talking about all the books that I read in January. So I had quite an interesting January. If you watched my December wrap up, you will know that one of my goals for this year is to read outside of my typical genres. So I went a little bit crazy at the library and I reserved a bunch of books that I will not end up reading in the allotted time, but I got through a good majority of them in January and I'm feeling good about that. So let's just dive right in. The first thing that I read in January, or the first 15 things that I read in January, were volumes 1 through 13 or 14 of Chainsaw Man. This is about Denji, who in the beginning of the manga basically takes on the chainsaw devil into his heart and becomes the chainsaw devil. So in this world, there are devils associated with certain things, and the stronger the fear around that thing is, the stronger the devil is. So like the gun devil is incredibly strong. And once he takes the chainsaw devil into his body, he joins an organization that is fighting to bring down these devils. And the characters that you meet along the way, some of them are devils, some of them are fiends, which are like people that have pieces of the devils. And Denji's overall goal with this organization is to bring down the gun devil. And he's also kind of just like the 16-year-old kid who just like has his own dreams and desires. He's a very funny character. There's several, overall this is just a funny story, but I think the thing that sets it apart and the reason that every single volume in this series so far has been 5 stars is that there's always something going on behind the scenes that you don't really know about, and it's just a lot more deep and wild than you really expect. Like when you first start it, you think Denji is just this kid who is a little bit naive and a little bit dumb and really just wants to like make out with girls, like that's his dream, but there's really a lot more going on. And so I'm reading that chapter by chapter as they come out, and I'm really enjoying it. Like I said, I've given all of the volumes 5 stars, so definitely a 5-star manga series. Then the next thing that I finished in the beginning of January was actually a carryover from December, and that is The Letters of Vincent van Gogh. This is a nonfiction collection of letters from Vincent van Gogh to his brother Theo, spanning several years, basically their entire relationship, and you're only getting Vincent's letters. You're not seeing the letters of anybody writing to Vincent, particularly his brother. And this sort of works to dispel some common misconceptions about Vincent, but also just get some insight into Vincent as a person. I didn't rate this because I don't generally rate nonfiction. I did read this pretty slowly. I think it took me like 2 or 3 weeks to finish it. But Vincent himself was a very frustrating man, but also someone that I think deserved a lot better than he got. And I really enjoyed reading this collection. It definitely lent an insight into Vincent van Gogh that I hadn't had before. And he wasn't someone that I'm particularly interested in, but he is an interesting person in history. And I will say that majority of this talks about like paintings that he's really loving, books that he's really loving, things like that. And that just wasn't really interesting to me, but you can see the progression of his art and also his mental well-being as the story goes on, or as the letters go on. So I definitely think that if you are interested in collections of like artist letters and getting into the minds of artists, then you will enjoy this. Next up, I read The Last Housewife. This is a thriller. I had read this author's first book. I think it was a debut thriller, her debut into thrillers. I think she's written other stuff. Anyways, it is a thriller that centers around a cult, and it follows 2 different timelines. In the current timeline, we are following a woman who is married in the beginning of the story, and she is listening to a true crime podcast that is hosted by someone that she was, I believe, in a relationship with when she was in college or something like that. And he calls out the death of one of her friends, and that has been labeled a suicide, and says, I don't believe it was a suicide. It's very similar to the death of someone that they were friends with in college, and she meets up with the podcaster and they work to find out the truth behind her friend's suicide. And then you're also getting flashbacks to when those girls were in college and they got embroiled in a sex cult. I do believe that this is based off of the Sarah Lawrence case. I don't know too much about that, but it is about a guy who, like in the book, a guy who's the father of one of the girls that's enrolled in the school, and he uses her and traps her friends and starts like a sex cult basically. And so you're following those two different timelines. This is much, much darker than In My Dreams I Hold a Knife. I think In My Dreams I Hold a Knife was very fun and kind of messy, and it was a lot of drama. This one does not hold back from anything. You are seeing a lot of abuse in many different angles, and it's very gruesome. Not in like a gore, blood, and guts sort of way, but it is very dark. And I loved this. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I think when it was good, it was really, really good. The issue that I had was there was like a middle bit that was really slow. That was just seemed to be like an in-between of her investigating, where we weren't really getting flashback scenes, but we also weren't getting much investigation. So that middle bit was slow, but when it was good, it was a very good book. All right, so next up, I read Rosario and Vampire Volume 1. A guy who goes to a school for monsters, but he's like a human, and he meets this vampire that he becomes best friends with, and I didn't like it. I gave it 2 stars. I don't think it was very compelling, and I know it's a more popular one, but it didn't have anything that really gripped me. I then read Volume 1 of Lore Olympus. I have read 2 seasons. I don't know how her episodes are broken up on Webtoons. I have read them, but I picked up Volume 1 and accidentally picked up Volume 3 for my 48-hour readathon, and I was going to read them, obviously, to catch up to where we currently are, and it didn't work out. But I did read Volume 1 in that video, and I gave it 5 stars. Lore Olympus is just this fantastic Hades and Persephone retelling, but you're following so many different characters. For the same readathon, I read All the Horses of Iceland, and I didn't rate this one, but if I had to rate it, I would give it like a 2-star. I didn't rate it because this is not typical, like this is not a typical read for me, and it's hard for me to give critique of a book or genre or subgenre that I'm not really familiar with, because I don't know what classifies as good and bad. But I know from my personal reading experience, I didn't really enjoy it. I picked up the book because I thought it was a story about a guy who kind of gets in with a group of traders, and they go along the Silk Road and they are trading essentially, and it results in him getting a group of horses that he then brings back to Iceland. And I was expecting this like folksy fairy tale writing that's very lyrical and beautiful, and it felt very cold and detached. I felt like I was reading a textbook, and it just wasn't quite the story that I felt like, it wasn't the story that I wanted and the story that I picked up the book to get. So it's unfair of me to rate it, given that it wasn't the story that I wanted or that I was expecting, and it's not my typical read. But yes, the writing was very dry, unfortunately. I then read Volume 1 of Cross Manage, which is a lacrosse manga, and in the first volume, the female main character is attempting to secure a manager for her lacrosse club at her school, and one day she is practicing in a field, and the male main character comes through and sees her practicing and decides to like give her some tips, and this first episode is her trying to convince him to become the manager of their lacrosse team. I gave the first volume 3 stars, but it's not something that I'm like super itching to get back to. It didn't grip me right away. There were some cute moments, but the story itself wasn't super inventive or new, so it's not the highest of priorities. So then for that 48-hour readathon, I read The Stolen Heir. This is the first book in the companion series to the Folk of the Air trilogy. If you have been on my channel for any length of time, I'm sure you've heard of me rave about the Folk of the Air trilogy. It's one of my all-time favorite YA fantasies. Jude is a standout character, and I forgot that this was even coming out, so I put this on the 48-hour readathon TBR, and I absolutely adored this. It is a 4-star read. I don't think this is going to be for everyone. It's not even going to be for everybody that loves The Cruel Prince. I definitely think this is more meandering and kind of fairy tale-esque than The Cruel Prince. So this follows 10 years, is it 10 or 7 years after the events of the 3rd book in the Folk of the Air trilogy. I'm not going to spoil that, but we are following Ren, who was a queen of a rival kingdom, and after the events of the 3rd one, she has been exiled to the human world, and she is living by herself. She had a family. She was originally a changeling, and that family was then made to see her as a monster, and then when she returned to the human world, when she was exiled, she didn't return back to them. So she is sort of living on her own. She doesn't have a home, and she is being hunted. She ends up getting saved by Oak, who is Jude's half-brother and the, eventual taker of the throne, eventual king of Elfhame, and he recruits her to help him because her mother is making creatures with the intention of taking back Elfhame from Jude and Cardan. Like I said, this is definitely not going to be for everybody. I can see the people who would read this and think that it didn't need to be written, but I found it just to be very like ethereal and just a trounce through Feyland that was just fun. It was interesting, and it's not very intense. It's definitely little scenes, and there isn't a lot of like high action, and it doesn't feel super impactful, but I think the Holly Black's writing dragged us through these quieter moments, and the way that this book ended has me intrigued for the rest of the series and to see where it's going to go. If you enjoyed the way that what Jude did to Cardan in The Cruel Prince, pick this one. This has a very similar ending. It's very fun, very enjoyable. It kind of turns a lot of stereotypical fantasy tropes on their head. And yeah, I thought it was 4 stars. I thought it was great, 4 stars. The second to last novel that I read for that readathon was The Spells for Forgetting. I have the Fairy Loot version. I don't really know how to classify this. I guess it's more like a literary fiction with a slight mystery and romantic subplots. But this is following 2 different people, 2 different points of view, Emery and August. And in the beginning of the story, August returns to this small island where he was raised because his mother has passed away, and she wants her ashes to be buried with her other relatives. Now, on this island, all of the families have lived on the island for generations. All of the businesses are passed down from family member to family member, and it's a very close-knit community. And August, when they were teenagers, someone of their friend group, of August and Emery's friend group, dies, and August gets accused of this murder. So him and his mother basically take off and go live in somewhere else. And he's now returned, and it kind of sparks up a relationship between Emery and August, who were high school sweethearts, and Emery has to do some investigating into the truth of actually what happened to her friend. This is very slow. There isn't really a whole lot of plot for the majority of this. I would say the last like 50 to like 30 pages are really where anything with the plot goes down. Mostly you are just like following these people on this like very atmospheric, coastal, rainy, gloomy island, and with a slight bit of like magical elements coming in, and like their life and their interactions and their secrets. And I think I'm making it sound a lot more interesting than it really was, because I did end up giving this 3 stars. If you can go into a story just really relying on the atmosphere to kind of carry you through it, then you will enjoy your time with this. But I need something else. The atmosphere can be a really strong element and a part of the book, but I need something else. And this just didn't flesh out any part of the story to make it something else. It wasn't a strong mystery. It wasn't a strong romance. It wasn't even really like a strong small town fiction story. Like, there wasn't enough, I think, emphasis put in other parts of the story like there was with The Atmosphere. So this did end up being a 3-star. And then the last novel that I ended up finishing for that readathon was the Society of Very Irregular Witches, or something like that. This is a cozy fantasy about a woman who gets a job as a nanny at a school for, or at a home for magical kids. She is a witch and she needs a job, and so she takes this job and she is training the children, and that's really it. There's not a whole lot going on. They are just learning how to use their magic and also becoming a found family. This is another story that got 3 stars for me. Kind of like I said with the Spells for Forgetting, I think there was a heavy emphasis on like the coziness of it all and the witchery, the foraging and the making spells and potions and stuff like that, and not enough put into any other part of the story. The found family element wasn't as strong. The romantic element wasn't strong at all. And then the last thing that I read for that video was I read 1 through 5 of Demon Slayer. This is about Tanjiro, who in this volume discovers that his entire family has been slaughtered by demons and his sister has been changed into a demon. He joins the Demon Slayer Corps, which is basically a group of demon slayers who go around and slay demons in the hunt for Muzan, who is the demon creator and the person that changed his sister. And I believe I gave a variety of ratings to these from 4 to 5. Some got 4, some got 5. I really enjoy this story. I am all caught up on the anime and I wanted to get the manga so I could kind of read on. I think Tanjiro is a standout character. There's several characters in here that are really fun, but Tanjiro really stands out as a very compassionate person, and I always like the inclusion of sort of like the backstory of the demons with this little hint of like something more for them, even though they've done these terrible things. So yes, 4 or 5 stars respectively for 1 through 5 of Demon Slayer. So then I read Tin Man. This is a pretty short novella and it follows the lives of 2 men, Ellis and Michael, who were friends when they were like 12. It sort of blossomed into this like romantic relationship, but that didn't really last all that long. We are following Ellis in the present. He is in his 40s or 50s and his wife has recently passed away, and we are in the beginning sort of following just his daily life. We are getting snippets of him as a child with his mother and also Michael when they first met, and how he's living now, and sort of snippets between that time period from when they met to now. And then we are also getting, at the end, the second half of the story, diary entries from Michael, and they are basically recounting again those years from when they stopped interacting. Like, there was a time period when Ellis got married and they stopped, like they went their separate ways, and it's following Michael's years then to when they, you know, met up again. And I don't think this had quite the punch that I was expecting from it. I was expecting sort of this emotional story, and unfortunately I think this was trying a little too hard to be like literary, and there was definitely elements of it that were emotional, especially in Michael's chapters when he's dealing with illness of a loved one, loss of a loved one, illness himself, things like that. So a naturally empathetic person would feel emotional for that, but I don't think that it had the impact that it intended and that I was looking for. So I did not rate this, again, because I am new to literary fiction in particular, and I'm kind of trying to find my footing, and I didn't want to rate this because I don't quite know what I do and don't like, right? I don't know what to criticize. I wouldn't even know what to give this because it's not like a 2-star, but yeah. So I did read this and I didn't rate it. So next up, I read A Psalm for the Wild-Built. This is the first in a Monk and Robot series by Becky Chambers. I think it's a duology. And this follows Dex, who is a monk, and in the beginning of the story they decide that they are unhappy working in the monastery that they work in, so they are going to take this tea wagon and travel around and sort of explore life in that way. They're going to go to different villages and sort of provide tea to people in need for whatever emotional reason that they need it. And then they decide that this also isn't very fulfilling to them, so they want to explore the nature around this city. So in this world, we are dealing with a sci-fi world. It's essentially like a moon planet, and centuries ago there were robots who gained sentience, and the robots decided that they no longer wanted to cohabitate with humans, and humans respected that decision, and basically robots went off and they have never been seen again. Humans live on a very small section of the planet, and then nature has been allowed to take back the planet. So they have decided that they are going to go to a far-off monastery and reconnect with nature and explore what's out there, and hopefully that will fulfill this hole or this purpose that they are looking for. And along the way, they meet a robot named Mosscap. This is a pretty sweet story. There are a lot of discussions about purpose and what you like, the ways that you hold yourself accountable that are unfair, and the language usage you use to yourself. Sort of conversations about life and why we're here, and why is it not good enough for us to just live a happy life? Why do we have to have this grand purpose? And I definitely think that this story feels unfinished, because I do believe the intention is to read the second novella, obviously, to sort of get the wrap up of the story. But I ended up giving this 4 stars. I think it was cozy, it was delightful. I enjoyed the conversations that were being had about purpose and the like during this, and it was just a nice, short, delightful time that felt satisfying, even though the story wasn't wrapped up. And I 100% will be finishing the duology. Next up, I read The Book of Cold Cases by Simone St. James. This is the 3rd thriller mystery that I have read by Simone St. James, and this one in particular is set during 2 different time periods. We are following a true crime blogger in present day, or 2017, is working as a receptionist, and she sees a woman who was accused of murder in the 70s, who obviously was not in prison, and she decides to interview her. And then you're also getting flashbacks to the 70s when these crimes were committed, and it's all kind of centered around this like haunted house that the woman lives in, and the stories and the history there. I gave this 4 stars. This was a definite improvement over the last Simone St. James I read, which was Broken Girls. That massively disappointed me. I would say Simone St. James is one of my favorite like mystery writers. I would say this kind of does lean as a thriller, but I tend to think of her as a mystery writer. I really enjoyed this. I think the atmosphere was perfect. This sort of haunted house, gloomy island next to the cliffs, and also the woman that she's investigating, Beth, is a very, very interesting character. She is manipulative. She's very good at sort of spinning the narrative however she wants it to go, and also you sort of feel this sympathy for her as you learn more about her. So definitely improvement. I really, really enjoyed the story, and I always love that Simone St. James includes some supernatural elements to it that are sort of ambiguous. There's always sort of an ending that is open-ended, which I enjoy in mysteries sometimes, and I appreciate that all of her stories are kind of women-centered. So definitely excited to continue reading Simone St. James, and if you are interested in a mystery set around a haunted house with a lot of intrigue, I would definitely recommend this one. Next up, I read Sword Heart, and I am happy to announce that I gave this 4 stars, and I fully understand why people love this story so much. If you are not familiar with Sword Heart, it is sort of a cozy fantasy about a woman who is recently widowed, and her husband her husband's family is trying to marry her off to a cousin, and in the beginning of the book she locks herself up in her room and she is going to kill herself with a sword, like an antique sword that's hanging above her bed. But when she draws the sword out of the scabbard, this human man is summoned and they go on an adventure to get her inheritance back. And I really enjoyed this. I think if you were a fan of Nettle and Bone, that sort of like whimsical, fantastical writing, you'll really enjoy this. I will say it's a lot softer. Nettle and Bone is definitely more horror. This is more like cozy, but I really enjoyed the romantic relationship here. The world wasn't massively explored, but it made sense enough to carry us through this adventure story. I am not one that tends to enjoy a story that is set on the road completely, but this was just so fun. And no matter what avenue, what genre T. Kingfisher is exploring, they do it so well, and I really enjoyed this. I do think it kind of petered off towards the end after like the adventure happens. It felt a little bit long because the adventure ended and I was like, okay, what more could we possibly be exploring? But I think it was a really good story. It was a really good listen, and it's just kind of fits perfectly into this like cozy fantasy subsection that people are really enjoying right now, and it's well worth a listen. So then I read The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. This is a short story collection basically about a bunch of women who are all tangentially connected through this church or through their faith, and every story is different. Most of them are about 10 pages, and there is a wide array of stories here, from a married couple or people that are trying to get married, or people who, there's unrequited love stories, there are messy family dynamics, a bunch of different stories all centered around women, and I enjoyed this. It's a good collection. The ones that were like more romantically centered I tend to enjoy more, obviously, but I think it's a good collection. I didn't rate this because it does feel more like nonfiction. It feels very personal, and I'm always hesitant to give more personal stories like this a rating, but I think there is a story in here for everyone. I think it's a good read, and I enjoyed most of the ones that I read. I would say my favorite is How to Love a Physicist, or what is it called? How to Make Love to a Physicist. Was definitely my favorite because it was sort of about a woman trying to work through some toxic behaviors in herself and some self-doubts in herself to make this romantic relationship work, and it was just a nice moment. So definitely recommend this short story collection if you have not checked it out already and you enjoy short stories. Next up, I read probably my favorite romance of 2023. I read 7 Days in June, and I cannot overstate how fantastic this romance story is. I ended up giving it 5 stars. This follows 2 writers, one who is a romance writer and one who is like a more literary fiction writer, and in throughout the story you are discovering these 7 days in the present and also the 7 days in the past when they were teenagers that they spent together. And this story packs a hell of a punch. It is dealing with addiction mostly. I would say addiction and abuse of all forms are the harder hitting topics that you're going to experience going into this, but there's also these fantastic moments of levity between the characters that you can really understand their love and how these 14 days altogether would lead them to the relationship that they are in at the end. If I had one complaint about it, I would say I don't like these switches of POV because the story is kind of short. It's on the shorter side. I would have liked that those pages be used in our couple's points of view rather than the like random points of view. I understand why the other points of view are there, but I would have liked more time with our couple. But I would highly recommend this book if you are a fan of like Kennedy Ryan, Brittany C. Cherry, these really emotional, hard-hitting romance authors. You will really enjoy this. It does have more of like a literary feel to it, but not in a bad way by any means. Yeah, it was beautiful. Just know that it is very, very heavy. It's way heavier than I was intending, or that I was expecting. And yeah, it was beautiful, 5 stars. So next up, I read The Water Dancer. This is a science fiction story about Hiram, who is an enslaved boy in the beginning of the novel, and through a series of events, he becomes an agent in the Underground Railroad. And this is, it's a lot deeper than that. There is a massive cast of characters from the beginning, with him working on the plantation to all of the people that he meets on the Underground Railroad. And this again is obviously a very heavy story. The science fiction element comes in regards to a power that Hiram has that is sort of mysterious throughout the beginning of the story, but all we know is that it took the memory of his mother for him to have this ability, and it connects back to his heritage. In the beginning of the story, he is enslaved on a plantation, and he is the child of the plantation owner, and this sort of affords him a different life than maybe some of the people that he grew up with. And he becomes educated, and he works with his brother like as his right hand basically. And after an accident happens, he goes on this series of events, like I said, that leads to him working for the Underground Railroad. And once that happens, it becomes more focused on the stories of the people that he meets along the way, the people that need help from the Underground Railroad. And I loved the ending of this. I think the ending is just brings it full circle, and it has an inclusion that feels melancholy but also very hopeful. And I did give this 4 stars. I do think that the more like magical realism elements felt a little bit clunky with the rest of the story, because you had sort of this very, you know, heart-wrenching story, and the magical realism just didn't quite fit. It didn't quite make sense in some parts, but I do think it added to the overall story. It enhanced the story, and the powers that he had, or the abilities that he had, made sense with the story, but sometimes the exploration or the execution of the abilities were a little bit clunky. So fantastic, fantastic story. I loved Ta-Nehisi Coates' nonfiction that I read, Between the World and Me, and I loved this as well. I think this is their like literary, their fiction debut, and it was incredibly strong for a fiction debut. So very excited to read more of his backlist. So next up we have Almond. This is about a boy in Korea who has a brain condition called alexithymia. That makes it hard for him to feel emotions like fear and anger. And in the beginning of the story, you are sort of following him with in his life with his mother and his grandmother, and they are attempting to teach him how to be normal, how to interact in regular situations so that he is not ostracized. And after a tragedy befalls his family, he is sort of left on his own, and we follow a friendship that he starts up with a local boy, and then also a budding romantic relationship. This is a pretty small snapshot of his life. We don't get it doesn't dig too deep into like long expansive years of his life. It's just his high school years, I would say. And you're following this friendship with this kid who has had a rough upbringing. He has less than attentive parents, and he joins a gang, and there's just a lot going on with him, and he is almost the exact opposite of our main character. He's very emotional, he has a lot of anger, and he lashes out, and that is not at all the way that our main character is. And I would say the romantic relationship isn't really it doesn't feel super impactful, I think. But I very rarely read books that are set in another place or inspired by another place and say that I think understanding the culture is really relevant and important to the book, because obviously books are inspired by the culture of the people that are, the culture that the authors live in, right, or grew up in. Me not understanding a culture or understanding a people has never hindered my ability to read the book or like my rating of the book, because not all stories are written for me, right? I can go into a story where I don't necessarily understand the language or the world building or something like that, and it's not the author's responsibility to teach every single person to get them to understand. If I want to understand, I need to do more work beyond the book. But I think because the way that he is raised and the culture that boys in Korea are raised in is so pivotal to an adolescent story, a coming of age story, I do think some of the nuances are lost on me. And that's not, again, a fault of the author, because the writing in the culture they're familiar with, it was just lost on me, and that's, again, not the book's fault. But I also don't think coming of age stories are for me. I don't tend to like children, and I don't tend to like children in books. So this is just a miss for me personally, but it is a fascinating concept. So next up we have Time is a Mother. This is a companion poetry collection following Ocean Vuong's first letter collection. The first one, On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, is letters written from him to his mother based on just like his experience growing up and his relationship with his mother. And then this is a collection of poems written after his mother has passed. So his grief and how he dealt with that and how he's living his life without her. And I also decided not to rate this one as well, because I'm not a poetry person, I have found. Ocean Vuong's writing is gorgeous, and I would definitely recommend On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, because that collection of letters is fantastic, but poetry is not my thing. I read poems and I can acknowledge the beauty of the writing and the syntax and the sentence structure, but the emotions of it are just lost on me. All right, we're getting to the end. So next up, I read There There. This is another short story collection-esque of, it's all centered around the same thing, and all of the stories are kind of connected, but it follows 12 characters, and it's all centered around the Oakland powwow. So these are all indigenous people, Native Americans, who are tied together in some way. And then about halfway through the book, we have the powwow. Something really big, something really impactful happens at the powwow, and you are following not only that, but the repercussions of it. There is a heavy emphasis on stories of modern indigenous peoples, and how indigenous people are not Native Americans that are often depicted in media, and they are their own people. They are present and here, and that is the heavy emphasis on this. I would recommend. The writing is breezy to get through, and the what happens at the powwow is quite emotional, so yes. And then the last story, the last book that I finished this month that is not mentioned in other videos is Moon of the Crusted Snow. I actually finished this audiobook today, and I gave it 4 stars. So this is a horror book. It's pretty short. I think the audiobook was only like maybe 6 hours long. It is about an Anishinaabe community, and in the beginning of the story, they lose all electricity, all power, and they cannot communicate with the outside world. And they don't know what's going on. They do have like backup generators and stuff, and they have food stored, stuff like that. But it quickly becomes obvious that it's not just like a power outage, that there is something more going on. They have some youths in their community who are several towns over at a college, and they show up one day and they said it's basically like an apocalypse. The power has completely gone out, the school has been abandoned, and they had to fight to get away. And then several days later, a mysterious man shows up and claims that he is just seeking asylum, and things in the community start going wrong. If you are a fan of The Marrow Thieves, which is like an apocalyptic story about an indigenous boy trying to bring his family back together, and you also are a fan of The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, like the very slow horror, you will love this. You will like eat it up. It's so good. I did give it 4 stars because it didn't quite hit that like 5-star feeling for me in horror, but I think it's a fantastic story. It's very slow, very quiet, And despite me not really liking apocalyptic stories, this one really worked for me, and the audiobook was great. It is not fast-paced in any regard, and majority of the time it's just like them going about living their daily lives, trying to reacclimate to this like apocalyptic world, and it's good. Very slow horror with a lot of tension. So yes, 4 stars. So that is it. That is all of the things that I read in January that were not mentioned in other specific videos. Do let me know down in the comments your favorite read of January, what you read, what you didn't like. If you've read anything that I read, I would love to hear it. If you don't have anything to say, leave a painting of some sort, some piece of art or something like that in the comments. If you are looking for more content from me, you can check out my Instagram and my podcast Instagram. You can also check out my podcast on all your favorite streaming platforms. It is a horror podcast. It's a lot of fun. Please do not forget to subscribe if you are looking for more content from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys in my next one.